What if the earliest records of humanity were never meant to be complete? What if the silence between the lines was intentional, an absence left behind like a footprint erased from wet clay? In the ancient cities of Sumer, the first known writing does not describe a beginning, but an aftermath. Something had already happened. Knowledge was already here. Humanity was already arranged, categorized, divided. And before you allow your body to sink fully into this quiet moment, take just a very small pause to like the video and subscribe, but only if something in what is being described makes you want to stay a little longer. If you wish, you can share the place and time where you are listening. There is a quiet curiosity about the small points of light drifting together through the same night. The tablets remain still, patient, waiting to be read again, not as answers, but as questions that never stopped asking themselves. Sumerian civilization appears in the archaeological record with an abrupt confidence that still unsettles historians. Cities rise where there were once marshes. Irrigation systems function with mathematical precision. Writing emerges not as a primitive experiment, but as a fully formed system capable of contracts, astronomy, administration, and ritual. The story does not unfold gradually. It arrives already composed, like a memory being resumed rather than a skill being learned. This is where the first fracture opens. The earliest clay tablets do not explain who taught humanity to count the stars, measure time, or divide land into precise units. They simply assume this knowledge exists. Humanity is already working, already serving, already placed within an order that is never justified. The records begin in the middle of a sentence, as though the opening pages were removed long before anyone realized they were missing. Within these texts, a presence lingers just beneath the surface, not metaphor, not abstraction, but named beings whose roles are described with unsettling practicality. They are not born, they arrive. They do not rule by faith but by function. They assign tasks, modify environments, and correct outcomes. They are not worshipped at first, they are obeyed. Later generations would call them gods. The tablets themselves are less poetic. Humanity, as described in these records, is not a single creation. It is an outcome. The language used to describe human origin shifts subtly from one tablet to another, as if the writers themselves were unsure which version was meant to be remembered. Some passages speak of shaping, others of mixing, others of correction. The words suggest refinement rather than invention, adjustment rather than birth. And then there is the numbering. 7 appears again and again, not as ornament, but as structure. 7 decrees, 7 measures. 7 classifications that appear in legal, astronomical, and ritual contexts. The number does not explain itself. It repeats with the quiet confidence of something already understood by those who wrote it. The silence around human diversity is particularly striking. Differences among people are treated as established facts, not developments. Social roles, labour divisions, and hierarchies are described without origin stories. No explanation is offered for why humanity is arranged this way, only instructions on how to maintain it. The record behaves as though the blueprint predates the archive. Modern scholarship often attributes this to mythological thinking, a symbolic worldview attempting to impose order on chaos. Yet this explanation falters when confronted with the precision of the texts themselves. These are not dreamlike epics. They are inventories, calculations, procedural descriptions. The same hands that measured grain yields also recorded the involvement of non-human authorities in human affairs. The discomfort begins here, because if these passages are dismissed as allegory, one must also explain why the allegory uses technical language, operational logic, and administrative tone. And if they are taken literally, even for a moment, then the origin of humanity becomes less like a story and more like a project. The record never states that humanity was created for beauty, curiosity, or wonder. It describes humanity as necessary, needed, designed to stabilize something that could no longer sustain itself alone. The implication is not cruelty, but indifference, a design problem requiring a solution. This is where later cultures intervene. As empires rose and fell, the language softened. The Anunnaki became distant. Their labour concerns transformed into moral lessons. Their presence faded into theology. What had once been described as instruction became commandment. What had once been function became worship. The sharp edges were filed down, not by malice, but by time and discomfort. Yet fragments remain. Linguists note inconsistencies in translation, where older meanings resist later interpretations. Archaeologists encounter tablets whose context is administrative, yet whose content describes events that do not align with known human capabilities of the era. Anthropologists observe mythological parallels across distant cultures that share no clear line of transmission, yet echo the same structural ideas: arrival, division, intervention, withdrawal. None of this proves intent. None of it confirms design. But together they form a pattern that refuses to dissolve. If humanity was shaped in stages, then the question is not who did the shaping, but why the record insists on obscuring the process. Why describe the outcome but erase the method? Why preserve the hierarchy but forget the reason for its existence? Perhaps the silence is not absence, but containment. Perhaps the earliest writers understood something about memory, that what is remembered can be questioned, but what is never spoken becomes unthinkable. A missing origin story does not provoke rebellion. It produces acceptance. Humanity begins its story already assigned a role, already grateful for order, already unsure whether anything else was ever possible. And if that is true, then the greatest mystery is not whether the Anunnaki existed as beings, symbols, or misunderstood forces, but whether the divisions they oversaw were meant to endure far longer than their presence. If humanity was arranged once, long ago, into categories that no longer have names but still cast shadows, how would anyone recognize them today? And if the record was fractured on purpose, who decided which parts of humanity should remember, and which should never even know what was missing? The uncertainty left hanging at the edge of the previous silence does not resolve itself when the record resumes. Instead, it deepens. The beings later called the Anunnaki do not step into the Sumerian texts as mythic ancestors or distant creators, but as administrators already burdened by responsibility. Their presence feels procedural, almost weary, as though they are inheriting a system rather than inventing one. They are introduced without ceremony, without origin stories, without justification for their authority. They simply are. The language used to describe them is precise in ways that resist poetic interpretation. Titles are functional, actions are logistical. They convene, deliberate, allocate, and decide. When conflict appears among them, it is not framed as cosmic good versus evil, but as disagreement over labour, burden, and sustainability. This is not the tone of religious exaltation. It is the tone of governance. One detail stands out with quiet insistence. The Anunnaki are never described as eternal. They age, they tire, they complain. Some passages suggest they are bound by constraints that predate their involvement with humanity. They are powerful, but not omnipotent. Their authority is real, yet limited. This ambiguity unsettles the later theological lens that insists on absolute divinity. The earlier record seems unconcerned with worship. It documents oversight. Humanity enters these passages not as a cherished creation, but as a response. Something in the system is failing. The workload is too great. The environment resists control. There is unrest among those tasked with maintaining order. The solution emerges gradually, spoken of in fragments that never fully cohere into a single narrative. Humanity is introduced as a stabilizing element, an intermediary presence capable of absorbing strain. What is striking is the absence of moral framing. No celebration accompanies this decision, no lament. The creation of humans is not described as a gift, nor as a punishment, but as a necessary adjustment. The language mirrors that of engineering rather than myth, refinement, correction, balance. Even the moments later interpreted as rebellion or fall read more like labour disputes than spiritual catastrophes. Across different tablets, the process itself shifts in detail. Sometimes humanity is shaped. Sometimes it is mixed. Sometimes it is awakened. These variations are often dismissed as mythological inconsistency. Yet the pattern suggests something else, a layered process remembered imperfectly, filtered through generations who no longer fully understood what they were preserving. Each version carries a fragment of the same unresolved memory. The Anunnaki are described as possessing knowledge that humanity does not acquire on its own. They introduce measures of time that align with celestial cycles far larger than agricultural necessity would require. They reference periods spanning tens of thousands of years with casual familiarity. They operate within a temporal framework that dwarfs a human lifespan, yet still treats time as finite. This introduces a subtle dissonance. If these beings are constrained by time, but operate on scales far beyond human perception, then humanity exists somewhere in between, long-lived enough to be useful, short-lived enough to remain dependent. The imbalance is structural, not moral. It is built into the arrangement. Later interpretations struggle with this imbalance. Religious traditions reshape it into hierarchy justified by virtue or sin. Modern scholarship often reduces it to symbolism, yet neither fully explains why the earliest descriptions are so restrained. Why avoid spectacle? Why omit grandeur? Why document power without glorifying it? One possibility lingers uncomfortably close. The original scribes may not have been writing mythology at all. They may have been recording inherited information in the only language available to them, compressing something technical into something survivable. The result reads neither as fiction nor as history, but as a residue, what remains when certainty has already eroded. Comparative mythology complicates this further. Similar figures appear in distant cultures, arriving from above or beyond, instituting order, dividing humanity, and then withdrawing. The details differ, but the structure repeats. Arrival. Instruction, stratification, absence. The recurrence does not confirm a shared event, but it does suggest a shared question that never received a satisfying answer. The Sumerian record never states that the Anunnaki leave. They simply become less present. Their direct involvement fades. Authority is transferred. Kings rule in their names. Priests speak on their behalf. The system persists, but its architects recede into abstraction. This withdrawal is never explained. It is treated as inevitable. If humanity was introduced as a solution to a problem, then the withdrawal implies that the solution worked, or at least worked well enough to allow its designers to step away. What remains is a civilization that remembers its overseers, but no longer understands its own role within the original system. The discomfort returns here, quietly, because a forgotten purpose does not disappear. It transforms. It embeds itself in social structures, in hierarchies, in assumptions about worth and order. It becomes tradition. It becomes destiny. It becomes something no one thinks to question, because questioning it would require remembering why it exists. The Anunnaki may be gods, symbols, or misunderstood forces. The texts never clarify, but the record insists on one thing with unsettling consistency. Humanity did not begin as an equal participant in its own story. It entered already shaped by decisions made elsewhere, for reasons only partially remembered. And if those decisions included division, categorization not by culture but by design, then the question is not whether humanity was created, but how many versions of humanity were considered acceptable, and more quietly still, how many were not. The unresolved tension left behind by the fading presence of the Anunnaki does not dissipate when the focus shifts to humanity itself. Instead, it sharpens. The Sumerian record does not treat the human being as a singular solution, but as a variable, something adjusted more than once, something refined through uncertainty. This is where the narrative grows most delicate because the texts hesitate. They circle the subject, approach it from different angles, and then retreat, as though the act of describing the process carried a risk of misunderstanding. Across multiple tablets, humanity is spoken of in plural terms long before nations or cultures are named. The language implies categories that precede civilization. Not tribes, not peoples. Something more fundamental. The words used suggest types rather than communities, conditions rather than identities. The distinction is subtle, but persistent. In some passages, the creation of humans appears successful but incomplete. Labour is performed, yet unrest remains. In others, the early humans are described as lacking something essential: discernment, endurance, adaptability. These deficiencies are not moralised. They are treated as limitations to be addressed. The tone remains pragmatic, almost clinical. The most unsettling aspect is not what the tablets say, but how casually they say it. Humanity is modified without drama, adjusted without apology. There is no suggestion that this process is unique or unprecedented. The act of revision is described as routine, as if earlier attempts had already failed, or at least fallen short of expectation. Later mythological frameworks would frame these moments as symbolic: clay figures animated by breath, blood mixed with earth, divine essence imparted to inert matter. Yet when stripped of poetic overlay, the underlying structure resembles something else entirely: iterative design, trial, outcome, correction. This interpretation unsettles modern sensibilities because it challenges the assumption of a single human origin. Evolutionary biology already acknowledges bottlenecks, sudden expansions, and unexplained leaps. Geneticists have identified moments where human diversity narrows sharply, then spreads again with new traits dominant. These are often attributed to climate catastrophe or migration. Yet the Sumerian texts introduce a different possibility: not replacement, but revision. The idea that humanity emerged in waves is not foreign to archaeology. Tool cultures appear abruptly, coexist briefly, then vanish. Anatomically, modern humans overlap with other hominins for thousands of years. The record is fragmented, incomplete, full of absences that resist clean narratives. The Sumerian account does not contradict this complexity. It mirrors it, but reframes it. What if the sevenfold pattern that recurs throughout the texts is not symbolic at all? What if it refers to stages, conditions, or classifications applied to humanity itself? The number 7 in Mesopotamian thought is not mystical in the later sense. It is structural. It denotes completeness within a system, not perfection but sufficiency. The tablets never list 7 races outright. There is no single passage that states such a claim plainly. Instead, the idea emerges indirectly, through repetition, through parallel structures, through language that implies differentiation without naming it. 7 allocations, 7 measures, 7 forms of obligation, 7 thresholds of responsibility. Humanity is woven into this structure, not above it. The discomfort grows when considering what is not recorded. There are no narratives of resistance, no stories of refusal. Humanity does not object to its role. This absence has often been interpreted as mythological simplicity. But another explanation exists. A being designed for function does not question purpose. Awareness itself may have been regulated. Some scholars have noted that early Sumerian descriptions of consciousness differ markedly from later philosophical accounts. Thought is externalized. Decision-making is attributed to gods, omens, signs. Agency is distributed outward rather than inward. Humanity acts but does not fully own its actions. This could be cultural metaphor, or it could be memory, distorted but persistent, of a time when autonomy was limited by design. If humanity was created in versions, then the question of continuity becomes unavoidable. Did earlier forms vanish, or were they absorbed? Were distinctions biological, cognitive, or social? The record refuses to clarify. It preserves the result but obscures the method, as though the method itself carried consequences best left unexplored. The later emphasis on bloodlines begins to make more sense here. Kingship is justified not by conquest, but by descent. Divine ancestry is not symbolic virtue, but qualification. To rule is to inherit something intangible, yet essential. This fixation on lineage suggests that not all humans were considered equivalent within the original framework. Modern discomfort with such ideas often leads to their dismissal. Yet the persistence of hierarchy across civilizations raises an uncomfortable parallel. If division was introduced early, not socially but structurally, then later inequalities may not be accidental distortions, but echoes of an ancient configuration whose logic has been forgotten. The Sumerian scribes never condemn this structure. They do not celebrate it either. They simply record it. The neutrality is perhaps the most unsettling feature of all. These are not moral texts. They are observational. They describe a world already shaped, already operating, already constrained by decisions no longer visible. And if humanity emerged from a process that included selection, categorization, and revision, then the greatest mystery is not who was chosen, but why the memory of choosing itself was allowed to fade. Was it lost through catastrophe, or deliberately softened through retelling until it became myth? Because a species that forgets it was designed may come to believe it is free, and a species that believes it is free may never ask whether the limits it accepts were inherited or installed. The suggestion that humanity may have emerged through revision rather than singular creation leaves behind a residue that does not settle easily. It lingers in the numerical language of the Sumerian world, where numbers are not decorative but architectural. Among them, 7 stands apart, not as mystery, but as framework. It appears where systems close upon themselves, where cycles complete, where something unstable becomes manageable. The recurrence of 7 in Mesopotamian texts has often been explained as cosmological symbolism. 7 visible celestial bodies, 7 gates, 7 days, 7 decrees. Yet this explanation begins to feel incomplete when the same number surfaces in context tied to governance, obligation, and human function. These are not abstract domains, they are operational. In administrative tablets, labour is divided according to fixed categories that do not always align with skill or age. In legal codes, responsibility is tiered in ways that imply pre-existing distinctions among people. In ritual texts, purification requirements vary not by action alone, but by status. The pattern suggests that humanity itself was not treated as a uniform population, but as a structured set. The Sumerian language does not possess a single word equivalent to the modern concept of race. Instead, it uses terms that imply condition, role, or nature. These distinctions are subtle, embedded in grammar rather than declared outright. A person is not simply human. They are something more specific, assigned, situated, contextualized within a larger system whose origin is never explained. 7 appears again here, quietly, not as a list, not as a proclamation, but as a rhythm. 7 allocations of responsibility, 7 thresholds of access, 7 classifications of service that recur across texts separated by centuries. The consistency is striking, not because it is obvious, but because it is understated. No one explains it. No one questions it. It is assumed. This assumption suggests inheritance, a system already in place, carried forward without understanding its origin. Much like language itself, whose rules are followed long after their reasons have been forgotten, these divisions persist because they work, or at least because nothing replaces them. Later mythological traditions would mythologize 7 as sacred, but the earliest usage feels utilitarian. 7 is the number of completion not because it is holy, but because it is sufficient. It marks the point at which a system can function without further subdivision. Anything less is unstable. Anything more becomes inefficient. If this logic were applied to humanity, then 7 would not represent difference for its own sake, but optimization. A way to distribute traits, capacities, and limitations across a population to meet a range of demands. This is not a moral framework, it is logistical. Such an idea collides uncomfortably with modern sensibilities, yet echoes of it appear in unexpected places. Anthropologists have long noted that early societies often organize themselves into rigid classes that resist change even when their original function disappears. Genetic studies reveal clusters of traits that persist across populations despite millennia of migration and mixing. Linguists trace structural differences in cognition reflected in grammar itself. None of this confirms intentional design, but it does suggest that humanity carries inherited structures that predate culture as we understand it. The Sumerian record does not tell us what these 7 divisions were. It does not name them. It does not describe their traits directly. Instead, it preserves their consequences. Certain people serve. Certain people rule. Certain people interpret signs. Certain people build. Certain people are sacrificed. Certain people remember. Certain people forget. These roles are not presented as choices. They are presented as conditions. To be born into one is to inhabit a function. Mobility exists but within limits. The system bends but does not break. This rigidity has often been attributed to early social inequality. Yet the question remains, why this structure and why this number? Why not 3 or 10 or 12? Why does 7 persist across domains that appear unrelated on the surface? One possibility is that the number reflects not culture, but constraint. A boundary set by something outside humanity itself. A template imposed rather than invented. The scribes do not argue for it. They simply work within it. If humanity was shaped to fulfill multiple functions within a larger system, then division would not be a flaw. It would be a feature. Diversity would not arise from chance alone, but from requirement. Difference would be maintained, not erased. The discomfort here is subtle but profound. Because if division is foundational rather than accidental, then later attempts at unification may always feel strained. Ideals of equality may collide with structures older than ideology itself, not because equality is wrong, but because the system was never designed for it. The Sumerian texts do not mourn this, they do not celebrate it, they do not moralize it, they record it the way one records the behavior of a river or the cycle of a star. This neutrality suggests acceptance, not endorsement, a recognition of limits, and yet the silence around the origin of these divisions remains intact. No tablet explains who decided 7 was enough. No record describes the moment these categories were fixed. The decision is already in the past by the time writing begins. This absence invites speculation, but resists conclusion. Was the division biological, encoded in form and function? Was it cognitive, shaping perception and behavior? Was it symbolic, later mistaken for physical reality? Or was it something layered, biological beginnings softened into cultural expression over time? The Sumerian record does not resolve this. It leaves the question suspended, like a breath held too long. Because to name the divisions would be to explain them, and to explain them would be to admit that humanity was never meant to be a single, undifferentiated whole. If 7 human conditions once existed, and if their names have been lost, then what remains are shadows, patterns of behaviour, recurring hierarchies, inherited tensions that feel ancient but unnamed. And the most unsettling question is not whether such divisions were created, but whether they are still quietly operating, long after the hands that shaped them withdrew. the idea of structured division does not remain confined to the Sumerian world. Once noticed, it begins to surface elsewhere, quietly, persistently, in cultures separated by oceans and millennia. This recurrence does not announce itself loudly. It appears in fragments, half-remembered stories, symbolic numbers, ritual separations that seem excessive unless they once served a deeper purpose. The pattern is never identical, yet it is unmistakably familiar. Across ancient traditions, humanity is rarely described as a single, unified creation. Instead, origin stories often unfold in layers. In some, humans are made more than once. In others, different kinds of humans emerge under different conditions, shaped by different forces, assigned different destinies. These narratives are usually interpreted as metaphor, moral lesson, or cosmological poetry. But when placed side by side, their structural similarities begin to feel less coincidental. In ancient India, early texts speak of humanity divided according to inherent qualities rather than mere occupation. These qualities are not learned, they are carried. In Mesoamerican traditions, successive human ages rise and fall, each defined by distinct traits and failures. In parts of Africa, oral histories describe ancestral groups arriving already differentiated, each bearing a specific role within the whole. None of these traditions claim superiority outright. They describe function. The recurring discomfort lies in the implication that difference preceded society. That hierarchy did not emerge from power struggles alone, but from an earlier arrangement that cultures later inherited and ritualized. Over time, what may have begun as structural necessity hardened into doctrine, then into law, then into identity. Memory transformed into belief. Comparative mythologists often caution against reading these parallels too literally. Shared symbols can arise independently, shaped by similar human concerns. Yet this explanation weakens when the symbols align not just in imagery, but in logic. Arrival from elsewhere, division of humanity, instruction, withdrawal, forgetting. The sequence repeats with remarkable consistency. If the Sumerian account were unique, it could be dismissed as local imagination. But its echoes suggest something more persistent, a shared human intuition that our origins are layered, that something intervened, arranged, and then stepped away. Whether this intuition reflects an actual event or a deep psychological imprint remains unresolved. The texts themselves do not clarify, they resonate. One of the most revealing aspects of these myths is their tone. They are rarely triumphant. Creation is not celebrated as a miracle. It is often depicted as a compromise, a correction, or even a mistake. The creators, gods, ancestors, forces are not always satisfied with the result. They adjust, they retry, they abandon. This dissatisfaction mirrors the Sumerian Records' quiet pragmatism. Modern archaeology complicates the picture further. Sites once believed to represent the dawn of civilization now appear to rest atop earlier foundations. Megalithic structures predate agriculture. Symbolic art predates settled life. Cognitive sophistication appears suddenly, without a clear developmental trail. These anomalies do not prove external intervention, but they do challenge linear narratives. Genetics adds another layer of ambiguity. Human diversity clusters in ways that are not fully explained by geography alone. Certain traits persist stubbornly across environments where they offer no obvious advantage. Bottlenecks reset populations, yet complexity returns quickly, as though drawn back toward a template rather than built anew each time. None of this requires the Anunnaki to be literal beings descending from the sky. The pattern holds even if they are understood as metaphors for forces humanity could not yet name, ecological pressures, lost technologies, forgotten societies. What matters is not their form, but their function within the story. They arrive with knowledge, they divide, they depart. Humanity remains, structured by what it no longer remembers. the persistence of caste, class, and inherited role across civilizations begins to feel less like coincidence and more like residue. These systems survive even when they no longer serve their original purpose. They justify themselves through tradition, morality, or divine will, but rarely through explanation. Their origins vanish into sacred time, beyond questioning. The Sumerian texts do not accuse, they do not warn, they simply observe. Later cultures add judgment, fear, reverence. The original record remains oddly neutral, as though neutrality itself were a form of restraint. To describe too much would be to risk awakening something better left dormant. This raises a troubling possibility. Perhaps the fragmentation of origin stories was not accidental. Perhaps clarity was intentionally eroded as stories travelled, translated, moralized, and ritualized. Not through a single act of censorship, but through a gradual softening. Edges rounded, details blurred, questions reframed as allegory. A story that is too clear invites challenge. A story that is symbolic invites reverence instead. If humanity was once divided according to design, whether biological, cognitive, or social, then remembering that design could destabilize systems built atop its forgetting. Equality, freedom, and self-determination rely on the belief that difference is accidental, not foundational. To question that belief is to reopen a wound civilization has spent millennia trying to heal, and yet the question refuses to disappear. Why do so many cultures remember multiple beginnings? Why does humanity so often describe itself as incomplete, corrected, or abandoned? Why does the idea of an earlier order, lost or withdrawn, persist beneath religion, beneath myth, beneath philosophy? The Sumerian record does not answer these questions. It simply stands at the beginning of the written memory, pointing not forward, but backward, toward something already gone, something whose traces appear everywhere once one learns how to look. If the division of humanity was once explicit and later obscured, then what remains are instincts without explanations, structures without blueprints, roles without names, and the quiet unease that perhaps the story of human unity was not the starting point, but the coping mechanism that came afterward. The persistence of layered origin stories across cultures leads inevitably toward the body itself, where memory sometimes survives longer than language. Long after myths soften into allegory and hierarchies harden into tradition, biology continues to carry traces of earlier decisions. It does so quietly, without narrative, without intent, encoded in patterns that can be measured but not easily explained. Human evolution, as currently understood, is not a smooth ascent. It is punctuated by interruptions. Genetic bottlenecks narrow diversity to improbable degrees, only for complexity to reappear with startling speed. Traits emerge suddenly, spread rapidly, and then stabilize as if guided toward a familiar configuration. These moments are often attributed to survival pressure or environmental change. Yet the pace at which cognition, symbolism, and cooperation consolidate remains difficult to model. The archaeological record mirrors this unevenness. Tools of remarkable sophistication appear without clear precursors. Symbolic behavior, burial rites, abstract markings, musical instruments arises almost simultaneously across distant regions. The timing unsettles expectations. It suggests not gradual accumulation, but activation, something latent becoming accessible. This is where the Sumerian memory begins to resonate again, not as proof, but as parallel. The texts describe humanity as capable, but incomplete, able to work, but not to govern itself fully, responsive, but not autonomous. Consciousness appears as something that can be expanded or restricted, awakened or muted. These descriptions, once dismissed as metaphor, align uncomfortably well with the idea of cognitive thresholds rather than linear growth. Neuroscience has identified regions of the human brain whose potential far exceeds everyday use, Capacity exists without activation. Awareness is selective. Attention narrows reality to what is necessary for function. This economy of perception keeps the system stable, but it also implies unused range, possibility held in reserve. If humanity was shaped to operate within certain bounds, then those bounds might not be imposed externally, but internally. Limits written into the architecture of thought itself. The idea is unsettling not because it implies control, but because it implies consent at a level beneath choice. Genetic variation further complicates the picture. Certain populations exhibit heightened sensitivity to pattern, rhythm, or spatial reasoning. Others demonstrate resilience, endurance, or adaptability under extreme conditions. These differences are statistical, not absolute. Yet they persist across environments where selective advantage is unclear. Culture explains some of this. Biology explains some. Neither explains all. The notion of 7 human conditions returns here, not as categories to be named, but as distributions to be observed. No individual embodies only one tendency. Traits overlap, blend, and shift, but the clustering remains. Humanity appears diversified not randomly, but redundantly, as though designed to ensure continuity under a range of possible futures. This redundancy is a hallmark of engineered systems. It allows failure in one area without collapse of the whole. Diversity becomes resilience, not virtue. Difference becomes insurance. The Sumerian texts never praise diversity. They depend on it. Their world assumes varied capacities and assigns roles accordingly. What later cultures moralize as inequality, the earliest record treats as infrastructure. The discomfort arises when considering how such infrastructure would persist once its purpose was forgotten. A system designed for balance can become oppressive when stripped of context. Roles harden into identities. Conditions become judgments. What was once functional becomes personal. Modern society struggles with this inheritance. We insist on sameness while navigating difference. We argue over equality while living within structures that resist it. The tension feels ancient because it is. It predates ideology. It predates history. Some researchers have suggested that human consciousness itself underwent a shift in the relatively recent past. Changes in language structure, self-reflection, and internal narrative appear abruptly in the archaeological record. The emergence of the introspective self, the sense of an inner voice distinct from the world, may be younger than humanity itself. If earlier humans experienced cognition differently, guided more by external cues than internal deliberation, then the Sumerian portrayal of decision-making attributed to gods begins to read less like superstition and more like memory. Agency may once have been distributed, not centralized. Responsibility may have been externalized by design. Such a configuration would be stable, obedient, and efficient. It would also be fragile once the guiding structures withdrew. Humanity would inherit capacity without instruction, power without understanding, freedom without preparation. This could explain the recurring theme of catastrophe in early myths, not as punishment, but as consequence. A system loses its stabilizers and oscillates wildly before finding a new equilibrium. Floods, fires, collapses, these are metaphors for systemic failure as much as environmental trauma. The genetic bottlenecks that punctuate human history may reflect these moments of instability. Populations shrink. Diversity collapses. Survivors carry forward a subset of traits. Yet the same distributions reappear, as though pulled back toward an older pattern. None of this confirms intent. It suggests constraint, a landscape shaped in advance, within which variation plays out but never escapes entirely. Humanity improvises within boundaries it did not choose. The Sumerian record does not lament this. It does not celebrate it. It assumes it. The scribes write as those born into a system already long established. Their concern is not origin, but maintenance, not freedom, but continuity. And yet, beneath the neutrality, a question hums quietly. If humanity carries latent capacities that remain unused, then what determines their activation? Is it environment, crisis, instruction, or something else entirely? If consciousness itself can expand or contract, then perhaps the sevenfold structure was never about bodies at all, but about modes of awareness, different ways of perceiving reality, different thresholds of responsibility, different relationships to time, memory, and self. These would not be races in the modern sense, but conditions, states of being distributed across a population to stabilize the whole. If this were true, then the forgetting of the system would not erase it. It would merely render it invisible. The machinery would continue to operate without manual, producing outcomes mistaken for nature or fate. And the most unsettling possibility is not that humanity was designed, but that it was designed to forget, to live within limits without perceiving them, to experience choice without seeing the rails beneath it. If the Anunnaki, or whatever they represent, withdrew after ensuring stability, then humanity's long struggle may not be toward freedom, but toward remembering what freedom once required, and whether awakening those dormant capacities would restore balance, or unravel a system that has held imperfectly for far longer than anyone remembers. The idea that humanity may carry dormant structures within its own biology leads naturally to the question of inheritance, not merely of traits, but of authority. In the Sumerian world, power does not arise from conquest alone. It descends. Kingship is not invented, it is transferred. The earliest rulers do not claim legitimacy through strength or charisma, but through proximity to something older, something no longer present yet still decisive. The king lists preserved on clay tablets read less like chronicles and more like ledgers. Reigns stretch far beyond normal human lifespan, measured not in decades but in spans that challenge biological plausibility. Later, scribes compress these numbers, reinterpret them, or treat them as symbolic. The earliest versions do neither. They record them plainly, as though longevity itself were an inherited condition rather than an achievement. This is often explained as mythic exaggeration, a way of elevating the past, yet the same texts are meticulous elsewhere. They track grain rations, labour quotas, astronomical cycles with precision that leaves little room for casual fantasy. The inconsistency is difficult to ignore. Why exaggerate only here? Why preserve impossibility in a record otherwise obsessed with accuracy? One possibility is that longevity was not universal. If certain lineages were altered, extended, or sustained differently, then extreme reign lengths would not be myth, but classification. Not everyone lived this way. Only those who carried something specific, something that justified rule. The fixation on bloodlines deepens this suspicion. Kingship passes through families believed to possess divine essence, not metaphorically but materially. Blood is not symbolic, it is substance. Rituals emphasize purity, separation, preservation. Intermixing is regulated, lineages guarded. The anxiety surrounding inheritance suggests fragility, as though dilution could destabilize more than political order. This concern appears across cultures that claim divine ancestry for rulers. Egypt, Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica all preserve the idea that leadership is biological before it is ideological. Authority is embodied. It resides in the body before it manifests in law. If humanity was divided into conditions or capacities, then leadership may not have been a role anyone could assume. It may have been assigned to those equipped to interface with structures others could not perceive or manage. Governance, in this sense, would not be domination, but mediation between systems human and systems inherited. The Sumerian record hints at this indirectly. Kings are described as intermediaries, not originators. They receive instruction, they interpret signs, they maintain alignment. When calamity strikes, it is often framed as a failure of alignment rather than moral collapse. The king did not listen. The signs were ignored. The order slipped. This language suggests a system sensitive to oversight, requiring constant adjustment. Leadership becomes maintenance rather than command. The king does not create law. He preserves it. Over time, as the original source of authority recedes, this function degrades. Kings become conquerors. Lineage becomes justification rather than qualification. Ritual replaces instruction. What was once a technical role becomes symbolic, then despotic. Yet traces of the original function remain. Sacred kingship persists long after its purpose is forgotten. Crowns, thrones, anointing rituals, these are residues of something older than politics. They suggest that rulership was once more than social agreement. It was alignment with a system humanity no longer understands. The discomfort deepens when considering who did not rule. The vast majority of humanity appears excluded from direct participation in governance. This exclusion is not framed as injustice, it is assumed. The system does not pretend to be egalitarian, it does not apologize, it simply operates. Modern interpretations often recoil from this. We read inequality backward into oppression, assuming malice where there may have been function. This does not justify cruelty, but it complicates origin. If division was structural rather than moral, then later abuse is distortion rather than intent. The question then becomes whether leadership itself was once a separate human condition, not superior, but distinct. A role requiring traits others lacked, just as builders require strength, and scribes require memory. If so, then the erosion of this distinction would not liberate humanity, it would destabilize it. This may explain the recurring theme of fallen kingship in myth. Golden ages ruled by semi-divine figures give way to chaotic eras governed by ordinary men. Decline is not framed as loss of virtue alone, but loss of capacity. The system is no longer properly interfaced. The machinery runs unattended. The Sumerian record never explicitly states that divine blood fades. It simply records that reign lengths shorten, authority fragments, instruction becomes ritual, memory becomes myth. The transition is gradual, almost imperceptible. No collapse, no rebellion, just forgetting. If humanity once relied on a small subset of individuals to maintain alignment with inherited systems, then the disappearance of those individuals would leave a vacuum. Power would remain, but guidance would not. Structures would persist without understanding. Law would harden. Hierarchy would ossify. This scenario does not require literal gods. It requires only that humanity once interacted with a system more complex than itself, and that this interaction required specialized mediation. When that mediation ended, humanity inherited responsibility without preparation. The persistence of elite lineages, aristocracies, and ruling classes across history may reflect attempts, conscious or not, to preserve this function. Blood becomes proxy for capacity. Ritual becomes proxy for instruction. Authority becomes performance rather than interface. The tragedy is not that hierarchy exists, but that its purpose has been lost. What remains is power without clarity, structure without meaning. Humanity continues to divide itself, but no longer remembers why. And beneath this forgetting lies a quieter question. If leadership was once a condition rather than an achievement, then what happens when a condition dissolves but the role remains? Does the system adapt, or does it fracture? Does humanity evolve beyond it, or repeat its failures indefinitely? The Sumerian record does not answer. It records the transition without commentary, as though aware that explanation would not prevent recurrence. The king still sits on the throne, the rituals still unfold, the structure holds, but the alignment is gone. If there were once 7 human conditions, and if one of them was entrusted with maintaining order, then its disappearance would echo across every civilization that followed. Authority would become unstable, equality would feel urgent but unworkable. freedom would expand faster than understanding, and the question that lingers, unspoken yet persistent, is whether humanity has been trying to replace that lost condition ever since, or whether awakening it again would restore balance, or unravel the fragile order built in its absence. The disappearance of those once entrusted with alignment leaves behind a silence that spreads outward, touching the land itself. In the Sumerian imagination, collapse is never purely social. It is environmental, astronomical, systemic. When order fails, rivers change course, skies darken, seasons slip out of rhythm. Civilization does not merely fall, it is interrupted. The archaeological record reflects this unease. Across Mesopotamia and beyond, layers of abandonment appear where continuity should exist. Cities are deserted abruptly, not gradually. Tools remain unfinished. Structures are left standing, as though their builders expected to return. Then, centuries later, new populations arrive, inheriting foundations they did not lay, and stories they only partially understand. These interruptions are often explained through climate shifts, floods, droughts, or conflict. Each explanation carries weight. None is sufficient alone. The pattern repeats too often, across too many regions, to be reduced to coincidence. Something periodically destabilizes human systems on a scale that exceeds local failure. The Sumerian texts remember these moments obliquely. They speak of floods not as singular disasters, but as resets. Time is divided into before and after, not by dates, but by conditions. Kingship is re-established, order is restored, writing resumes. The record begins again, as though the gap were not absence, but erasure. The most famous flood narratives are often treated as mythic exaggeration. Yet geology confirms that large-scale flooding did occur in the ancient Near East, repeatedly, with enough force to reshape settlement patterns. Meltwater pulses at the end of the last ice age inundated coastlines worldwide. Entire cultures would have been displaced, their knowledge fragmented or lost. But the Sumerian memory adds another layer. Floods are not only natural events, they're consequences, not punishments, but corrections. The language implies recalibration rather than destruction. A system exceeds its limits, balance fails, a reset follows. This interpretation aligns uncomfortably well with systems theory. Complex systems, when pushed beyond tolerance, do not collapse gracefully. They cascade. Small instabilities amplify until the system reorganizes at a lower level of complexity. Recovery is possible, but only after simplification. Human civilization behaves similarly. Populations grow, hierarchies entrench, resources strain, coordination fails. Then comes collapse, violent or slow. And afterward, rebuilding begins with fewer people, simpler structures, and inherited fragments of what came before. If humanity was originally designed to operate within specific parameters, then exceeding those parameters could trigger systemic correction, not imposed by intention, but by constraint. The environment becomes the mechanism through which balance is restored. The Sumerian record does not moralize these events. Floods are not divine wrath. They are inevitabilities. The gods do not rage. They warn or they withdraw. Humanity suffers not because it is sinful, but because it is misaligned. This distinction matters. A punitive worldview demands obedience. A corrective worldview demands adjustment. The early texts lean toward the latter. The Anunnaki do not destroy out of anger. They respond to imbalance. After each interruption, humanity returns altered. Not transformed entirely, but narrowed. Knowledge survives unevenly. Some technologies are lost. Others persist inexplicably. The new world is not blank. It is palimpsest. This may explain why early civilizations appear suddenly sophisticated. They are not inventing from nothing. They are recovering fragments, reassembling systems whose original coherence has been broken. Writing emerges not as a first step but as a recovery tool, a way to anchor memory against the next disruption. The repeated emphasis on recording, preserving, copying suggests anxiety, a fear that what is known may not survive. Clay tablets are durable, they endure flood and fire. Oral tradition alone is not enough. If humanity experienced multiple resets, then the fragmentation of origin stories becomes understandable. Each cycle preserves some knowledge and loses others. Over time, the original structure becomes obscured, its purpose diffused across myth, ritual, and custom. This diffusion may be intentional or emergent, it may not matter. What matters is that humanity carries forward the effects of design without retaining the blueprint. Systems persist without explanation. Roles endure without memory. The number 7 resurfaces here as well. 7 generations before renewal. 7 measures before collapse. 7 thresholds crossed before catastrophe. These patterns may reflect observation rather than doctrine. Early humans noticed rhythms in failure and encoded them symbolically. If so, then 7 is not a mystical constant, but a warning interval, a measure of how long complexity can grow before instability sets in. Humanity learns, forgets, rebuilds, and forgets again. The Sumerian record ends and begins repeatedly. Each new beginning carries echoes of the last. Kingship returns, hierarchy reforms, division persists, the same structures reappear, as though drawn back by gravity rather than choice. This repetition suggests that humanity does not freely design its civilizations. It selects from a limited set of viable configurations. Some work better than others. None escape collapse indefinitely. If the Anunnaki, or what they represent, were once involved in managing these cycles, their withdrawal would leave humanity to navigate them alone. The resets would continue but without guidance. Correction would become catastrophe. The lingering question is whether humanity is still within such a cycle, whether the modern world, with its unprecedented complexity and global interdependence, is approaching limits set long ago. Not moral limits, but systemic ones. The Sumerian scribes did not know the future. They recorded the past as pattern, not prophecy. Yet the unease in their text suggests awareness, an understanding that civilization is fragile, that balance is temporary, that memory is incomplete. If humanity was once reset deliberately, or inevitably, then the forgetting of origin may not be failure. It may be adaptation, a way to continue without the burden of knowing what has been lost. But forgetting carries cost. It invites repetition without learning. It allows systems to rebuild without understanding why they fail, and if the original divisions within humanity were meant to stabilize these cycles, then their erosion could accelerate collapse rather than prevent it. Equality without integration, freedom without alignment, complexity without constraint. The record does not warn explicitly. It does not predict. It simply shows that before every silence there was confidence, and before every rebuilding there was forgetting. If humanity stands once again at the edge of such a silence, the question is not whether collapse will come, but whether remembering fragments of an older design could alter its shape, or whether remembering too much would hasten the very correction the system has always enforced. After each interruption, when the dust settles and rivers find their courses again, something subtle changes in how knowledge is held. The Sumerian record begins to narrow. What was once distributed becomes concentrated. What was once observed becomes interpreted. And what was once remembered collectively begins to be guarded. The rise of the priestly class marks this shift with quiet inevitability. These figures do not emerge as innovators, but as custodians. Their authority rests not on invention, but on proximity to what remains of earlier understanding. They do not claim to create truth. They claim to preserve it. Yet preservation, when selective, becomes transformation. In temple complexes, knowledge is stored alongside offerings and tools, treated as both sacred and dangerous. Astronomical observations are recorded with care, but access is restricted. Ritual language grows increasingly formal, less descriptive, more symbolic. The same events are told again and again, but with fewer details each time, as though precision itself were being slowly dissolved. This contraction does not appear malicious. It appears protective, a recognition that certain forms of understanding, once separated from their original context, could destabilize rather than enlighten. Better to encode them in ritual, better to veil them in story, better to make them unquestionable. The Sumerian scribes begin to copy rather than compose. Tablets reference older tablets now lost. Authority is derived from antiquity rather than clarity. The older the source, the less it is explained. Time itself becomes a credential. This is where the record grows most opaque. Not because information disappears entirely, but because it becomes stratified. Surface narratives remain accessible. Deeper meanings require initiation. The gap between knower and follower widens, mirroring the earlier divisions within humanity itself. If humanity was once organized according to function, then knowledge would naturally follow similar lines. Those tasked with mediation would hold information others could not use safely. Over time, as mediation fades into ritual, the reason for restriction is forgotten, but the restriction remains. The priest becomes interpreter rather than interface. Signs replace instruction. Omens replace systems. What was once technical becomes symbolic. This shift preserves continuity at the cost of comprehension. Comparative evidence supports this pattern. Across ancient civilizations, early texts are concrete and operational. Later religious texts grow allegorical. Laws replace procedures. Doctrine replaces description. The transition coincides not with ignorance, but with overcomplexity. Systems grow too large to manage directly. Abstraction becomes necessary. Yet abstraction carries risk. Symbols can be reinterpreted. Rituals can be co-opted. Knowledge divorced from context becomes vulnerable to misuse. The Sumerian record hints at this danger indirectly. Warnings appear not as prohibitions but as consequences. When rituals are performed incorrectly, balance fails. When signs are misread, disaster follows. The texts do not threaten punishment. They describe malfunction. This suggests that knowledge once served a stabilizing role. It was not meant to elevate, but to align. When alignment fails, correction follows, not as judgment, but as necessity. As centuries pass, the custodians of knowledge become authorities in their own right. Their interpretations solidify into canon. Questioning becomes transgression. The memory of uncertainty, the acknowledgement that knowledge was partial, provisional, fades. This is how systems protect themselves. They replace open-ended inquiry with closed loops. Truth becomes static. Authority becomes self-referential. The Anunnaki recede further during this period, transforming from administrators into distant gods. Their practical concerns dissolve into moral narratives. Labor disputes become cosmic wars. Systemic limits become ethical commandments. The shift is subtle, but profound. What was once about balance becomes about obedience. This transformation may not have been intentional. As the original framework eroded, humanity filled the gaps with meaning. Myth softened what could no longer be explained. Story replaced system. Yet something is lost in this exchange. Without access to the underlying logic, humanity inherits rules without reasons. Structure persists, but flexibility vanishes. Adaptation becomes slower, more painful. The rise of orthodoxy marks a further narrowing. Competing interpretations are suppressed, not because they are false, but because multiplicity threatens cohesion. The system values stability over accuracy. Lost libraries, destroyed temples, fragmented tablets, these are often attributed to conquest or neglect, yet some losses appear internal. Knowledge that complicates authority disappears quietly. Copies cease. Translations shift emphasis. What remains is what serves. This does not require conspiracy. It requires incentive. Systems preserve what stabilizes them. They discard what destabilizes. If the original divisions within humanity were meant to distribute function, then centralized control of knowledge would represent a deviation from that design. Information accumulates where it cannot be fully integrated. Power concentrates. Balance strains. The Sumerian record does not condemn this. It documents it obliquely. The tone grows anxious, omens multiply, rituals proliferate. The system compensates for uncertainty with repetition. Modern echoes of this process are difficult to ignore. Institutions hoard information. Expertise becomes inaccessible. Complexity increases faster than understanding. Trust replaces comprehension. The question then arises, was the original system designed to prevent this? Did the division of humanity include safeguards against centralization? And if so, what happens when those safeguards erode? If certain human conditions were meant to hold, interpret, or distribute knowledge differently, then collapsing those distinctions could destabilize the entire structure. Equality without integration may flatten function rather than enhance it. This does not argue against equality as an ethical ideal. It suggests that systems require careful transition. Removing structure without replacing function invites failure. The Sumerian scribes appear aware of this tension. Their writing becomes more cautious, more indirect. They preserve fragments without explanation, trusting future readers to intuit what they can no longer articulate. Perhaps this is why the record feels incomplete, not because it is careless, but because it is restrained, a recognition that some knowledge, once untethered from its original context, cannot be safely transmitted. If humanity was never meant to remember everything, then forgetting may be a form of protection. But protection comes at a cost. Without memory, repetition becomes inevitable. And so the record continues, quieter now, more symbolic, more guarded. The questions it raises grow sharper as the answers fade. Who decides what is remembered? Who determines what is too dangerous to know? And at what point does protection become control? If humanity was once structured to balance knowledge across conditions, then the concentration of understanding within institutions marks a departure whose consequences are still unfolding. The system persists, but alignment weakens, and the unease returns, softly, insistently. Not as fear of hidden rulers or lost gods, but as recognition that something essential has been misplaced, not destroyed, not erased, simply set aside, waiting for conditions under which it might once again be understood. As knowledge narrows and authority hardens, the memory of earlier frameworks undergoes a final transformation. What was once described in practical terms becomes moralized. What was once negotiated becomes commanded. The Anunnaki, already distant, are reshaped again, this time not by forgetting, but by reinterpretation. Their presence survives, but only as shadow. In later Mesopotamian texts, the language shifts decisively. The beings who once argued over labour now issue decrees. The administrators become judges. Balance becomes obedience. This change is not abrupt. It unfolds slowly, carried forward by scribes who inherit stories without inheriting their operational meaning. The record becomes smoother, more coherent, and less informative. This is how systems adapt to loss. When function disappears, narrative expands to fill the space. Explanation gives way to justification. What can no longer be demonstrated must be believed. The Anunnaki are no longer described as constrained or fatigued. Their limitations vanish. They become timeless, absolute, morally charged. Where earlier texts noted disagreement among them, later traditions emphasize unity. Complexity is flattened. Ambiguity is resolved in favor of clarity, even if that clarity is false. This transformation mirrors a broader human pattern. As societies grow larger and more interconnected, they require simpler stories to maintain cohesion. Nuance becomes dangerous. doubt destabilizes. The past must be made legible to the present, even at the cost of accuracy. In this process, the earlier divisions within humanity are reframed as moral hierarchies. Function becomes virtue. Condition becomes worth. What may have once been distributed capacity is reinterpreted as reward or punishment. The sevenfold structure dissolves into binary opposition, favoured and unfavoured, pure and impure, chosen and fallen. The memory of multiple human conditions becomes uncomfortable. It suggests inequality without blame, difference without guilt. Moral systems require accountability. They need reasons that can be taught and enforced. Structural inheritance does not satisfy this need. And so the story is rewritten. Humanity is no longer adjusted or refined. It is tested. Failure is no longer malfunction. It is sin. Correction is no longer recalibration. It is judgment. The flood becomes punishment rather than reset. Collapse becomes consequence rather than constraint. This shift has profound effects on how history is remembered. Earlier catastrophes are no longer opportunities to learn about systemic limits. They become cautionary tales about behaviour. The lesson changes. Obedience replaces alignment. Faith replaces understanding. The Anunnaki themselves become remote enough to merge with emerging monotheistic frameworks. Their plurality collapses into singular authority. Their administrative logic dissolves into cosmic will. The world no longer operates according to balance. It obeys command. This reinterpretation is not merely theological, it is political. Centralized authority benefits from centralized divinity. If power descends from an unquestionable source, then hierarchy requires no explanation. It simply reflects the order of the universe. In this context, the earlier fixation on bloodlines transforms again. Divine ancestry becomes symbolic rather than functional. Kings rule by favour rather than capacity. The idea of inherited mediation persists, but its original purpose is obscured. What remains is privilege without responsibility. The Sumerian record, when read backward through these later lenses, appears primitive, naive, mythic. Its neutrality is mistaken for simplicity. Its restraint is mistaken for ignorance. The possibility that it preserved something too complex to explain is rarely considered. Modern scholarship often inherits this bias unconsciously. We assume progress moves from myth to reason, from superstition to science. But the record resists this narrative. The earliest texts are often the most technical. Later ones are more symbolic. Knowledge does not always advance. Sometimes it condenses. This condensation leaves behind distortions. The Anunnaki become monsters or angels. Their interactions with humanity become wars or romances. Their administrative concerns become cosmic drama. The practical disappears entirely. Yet the structural residue remains. Hierarchy persists. Division persists. The sense that humanity is incomplete persists. The feeling that something essential has been lost persists. This is why the idea of 7 human races continues to resurface in distorted forms. It appears as caste, as colour, as destiny, as temperament. It is reinterpreted again and again, stripped of its original context, burdened with moral weight it may never have carried. The danger of this transformation is not that it introduces inequality. Inequality already existed. The danger is that it removes flexibility. When difference becomes moralized, adaptation becomes conflict. When roles become identities, systems cannot adjust without breaking. The early Sumerian texts suggest a world in which division was dynamic, responsive, and contextual. The later moral frameworks freeze these divisions into permanence. What was once adjustable becomes sacred. This freezing may explain why humanity struggles to reconcile ideals of equality with persistent difference. We inherit structures without understanding their purpose, then attempt to dismantle them without replacing their function. The result is instability, social, psychological, systemic. None of this requires intentional deception. It requires only time, fear, and the need for cohesion. As memory fades, certainty becomes more valuable than truth. The Anunnaki, by receding into abstraction, become safe. They can no longer be questioned. Their earlier ambiguity would invite doubt. Their new absoluteness demands submission. Yet beneath this transformation, the older questions continue to press. Why was humanity described as incomplete? Why does the record imply revision? Why does division appear so early, so persistently, and so neutrally? These questions survive precisely because they were never answered. They pass through cultures disguised as myth, resurfacing whenever systems strain under their own weight. They whisper that something about humanity's beginning remains unresolved. If the transformation of the Anunnaki from administrators to gods marks a loss of understanding, then the task of remembering is not about restoring belief, but about recovering context. Not about worship, but about alignment. The Sumerian scribes did not predict this transformation. They simply wrote what they knew, leaving space where knowledge ended. Later cultures filled that space with certainty, and perhaps that is the final distortion. Not the invention of gods, but the refusal to tolerate not knowing. The need to replace incomplete memory with complete narrative. If humanity was shaped within limits, then forgetting those limits may feel like freedom, but it may also remove the guardrails that once prevented collapse. The moralized world promises meaning, but it cannot replace function. As the Anunnaki vanish into theology, humanity inherits a universe governed by rules it no longer understands, enforced by authorities it can no longer question. The system holds, but only just. And the quiet question remains, unvoiced but persistent. If the original framework was not moral but structural, then what would it mean to remember it now, not as belief, but as constraint? Would such remembering liberate humanity from inherited distortions, or reveal that the freedom we defend has always been narrower than we imagined? As the moralized universe settles into place, another kind of disappearance begins, quieter than flood or conquest, yet equally decisive. Texts vanish, not all at once, not violently. They thin, they fragment. They survive in references to other texts that no longer exist. Knowledge does not end, it dissolves. The Sumerian scribes themselves were already aware of this erosion. Many tablets speak of earlier records, older accounts, ancestral archives now inaccessible. Authority increasingly rests on citation rather than explanation. A statement is true because it was written before. The deeper its origin recedes, the less it can be questioned. Libraries emerge as sacred spaces not merely because they store knowledge, but because they protect it from misuse. Yet protection implies restriction. Access narrows, interpretation becomes centralized, translation becomes selective. What cannot be easily reconciled with the present is left untranslated, or rendered harmless through ambiguity. This process accelerates as empires expand. When cultures collide, their memories compete. Some are preserved, others are reclassified as heresy, superstition, or irrelevance. The criteria are rarely explicit. They do not need to be. Systems retain what stabilizes them. The fate of certain tablets illustrates this quietly. Some are meticulously copied for centuries. Others appear once and are never referenced again. Their content may be fragmentary, but the pattern is telling. Texts describing ritual and hierarchy persist. Texts describing process, ambiguity, or uncertainty fade. This selectivity shapes how the past is understood. Humanity's origin becomes a story with a beginning, middle, and moral end. The earlier sense of revision, of adjustment without judgment, disappears. The idea that humanity was modified rather than created becomes uncomfortable. It suggests contingency where certainty is needed. The loss is not only textual, it is interpretive. As writing systems change, meanings shift. Words that once denoted condition or function come to signify virtue or vice. Metaphors harden into facts. Context evaporates. Modern scholars often encounter this as translation difficulty. Certain terms resist equivalence. They seem to gesture toward concepts that no longer exist. These are often explained away as poetic flourish. But the consistency of the problem suggests something else: conceptual loss. If humanity once understood itself as part of a larger system, then losing the language to describe that system would force a reinterpretation of experience itself. What was once alignment becomes obedience. What was once function becomes identity. What was once constraint becomes destiny. The destruction of libraries, whether in Mesopotamia, Alexandria, or elsewhere, is often framed as tragedy. Yet the more consequential loss may be the quieter one: the gradual decision not to copy certain texts, not to teach certain interpretations, not to ask certain questions. This kind of loss leaves no ruins, it leaves absence. The Sumerian record, already fragmentary, becomes increasingly symbolic as it passes through successive cultures. Later compilers preserve the poetry, but lose the procedure. They retain the names, but forget the roles. The Anunnaki survive as mythic figures, stripped of context, safe for worship, but useless for understanding. The sevenfold structure dissolves similarly. It reappears in mystical systems, in cosmology, in numerology, but detached from any human application. What may once have described distribution of capacity becomes abstraction. 7 becomes sacred precisely because its practical meaning is gone. This abstraction allows survival. Concepts too concrete invite contradiction. Concepts too vague invite reverence. By becoming symbolic, the remnants of the original system avoid scrutiny. Yet symbols have a way of reasserting themselves. They appear in dreams, in art, in philosophical speculation. The number 7 returns again and again, hinting at order without revealing its nature. Humanity remembers shape without substance. The tension between remembering and forgetting becomes a defining feature of civilization. Too much memory destabilizes, too little repeats mistakes. Cultures oscillate between preservation and erasure, rarely aware of what is being sacrificed. Modern archaeology confronts this oscillation directly. Each new discovery promises clarity, yet introduces new uncertainty. Tablets contradict one another, dates shift, narratives fracture. The past refuses to settle into a single story. This refusal is often interpreted as limitation of evidence, but it may reflect something deeper, that the past itself was not unified, that humanity's origin was not a single event, but a sequence of adjustments whose coherence depended on a framework now missing. If so, then no amount of excavation will restore clarity. The blueprint is gone. Only fragments remain. The temptation is to fill the gaps with speculation, to imagine lost technologies or hidden rulers. These narratives offer comfort. They replace absence with certainty. Yet they risk repeating the very process that obscured the original record, substituting explanation for alignment. The Sumerian scribes did not attempt this. They left gaps. They recorded uncertainty. They allowed silence to remain. Their restraints suggest awareness that some knowledge cannot be reconstructed once context is lost. This restraint contrasts sharply with later traditions that seek completeness at all costs. A complete story feels safe, it reassures, it closes questions. But closure may not be truth. If humanity was once shaped within limits it no longer remembers, then attempting to reconstruct those limits without understanding their purpose could be dangerous. A system revived incorrectly can fail catastrophically. Perhaps this is why so much of the record was allowed to fade, not through conspiracy, but through caution. A recognition that fragments without framework invite misuse. Yet caution has its own cost. Without memory, humanity navigates complexity blindly. It builds systems that strain against unseen constraints. It repeats cycles of expansion and collapse, mistaking novelty for progress. The loss of early records thus becomes more than historical tragedy. It becomes existential condition. Humanity lives with inherited structures it cannot explain, guided by stories that no longer match their origin. The question then is not whether lost libraries can be rebuilt or missing tablets found. It is whether humanity is prepared to encounter an origin story that offers no moral clarity, no chosen status, no singular beginning. A story that suggests humanity was adjusted, not exalted. That division was functional, not punitive. That collapse was systemic, not sinful. Such a story would unsettle more than it comforts. Perhaps that is why it remains incomplete. As fragments continue to surface, as translations evolve, as comparisons widen, the outline of an older framework flickers briefly into view, not clearly enough to confirm, not faintly enough to dismiss. The silence persists, not as emptiness, but as boundary, a reminder that some questions survive precisely because they were never meant to be answered fully, only approached, cautiously, with awareness of what forgetting once protected and what remembering might yet disturb. When modern scholars return to the fragments that survived, they do so with tools the original scribes could not have imagined. Carbon dating, comparative linguistics, genetic modelling, satellite archaeology, each promises clarity. Yet with every layer of precision added, the picture grows less stable. The past does not sharpen, it fractures. The rediscovery of Sumerian texts in the 19th and 20th centuries was initially treated as triumph. Writing had been found at its source. Civilization had a birthplace. Origins could finally be traced. But the optimism did not last. The more tablets were translated, the less coherent the story became. Contradictions multiplied, chronologies overlapped, motives blurred. Most unsettling of all was how little these texts resembled expectation. They did not read like primitive myth. They read like records written by people who assumed their readers already knew what had happened. The absence of explanation felt deliberate, not careless. Modern academia responded cautiously. Interpretations emphasized metaphor. Divine beings were reclassified as symbolic personifications. Longevity became numerology. Creation narratives became moral allegory. These moves were not dishonest. They were protective. Literal readings raised questions that could not be contained within existing frameworks. To treat the Anunnaki as anything other than symbolic risked destabilizing foundational assumptions about human uniqueness and autonomy. To treat the sevenfold structures as anything other than cosmological symbolism risked reopening discussions about inherent human difference that history had taught humanity to fear. And so, a boundary was drawn. The text could be studied, but only within safe interpretive limits. This boundary is rarely acknowledged openly. It operates through tone, emphasis, omission. Certain questions are framed as fringe not because they lack evidence, but because their implications exceed what institutions are prepared to integrate. Curiosity becomes caution. Speculation becomes taboo. Yet the questions persist, resurfacing at the margins of academic discourse, in interdisciplinary studies where rigid boundaries soften. Linguists note that some Sumerian terms describing human condition resist translation into modern categories. Anthropologists observe that social stratification appears fully formed in the earlier cities without evidence of gradual emergence. Geneticists encounter patterns that suggest selection pressures beyond survival alone. None of these observations demand a single explanation. Together, they demand humility. The idea that humanity might not have begun as a unified biological or cognitive state challenges deeply held narratives. It disrupts the story of linear progress from simplicity to complexity. It suggests instead a story of narrowing, of capacities once broader, later constrained. Such a suggestion is uncomfortable not because it implies loss, but because it implies design. and design implies intention, whether natural or otherwise. It raises the question of limits not chosen, of freedom emerging within boundaries already set. Modern resistance to these ideas often takes the form of methodological rigor. Claims must be testable, evidence must be measurable. Yet some of the most consequential aspects of human existence, consciousness, meaning, value, resist such measurement. The absence of proof does not equal proof of absence. The Sumerian record exists in this ambiguous space. It neither confirms nor denies modern theories. It gestures, it hints, it leaves room. What is striking is how often modern discoveries echo ancient discomforts. As neuroscience reveals the modular nature of cognition, the idea of distributed capacities becomes less speculative. As genetics uncovers ancient bottlenecks and rapid expansions, the notion of revision gains plausibility. Systems theory describes collapse and reset as natural outcomes of complexity. The flood narratives lose their mythic excess. The danger lies not in acknowledging these parallels, but in forcing them into a single explanatory framework. To declare that humanity was engineered by external beings is to replace one certainty with another. The Sumerian texts themselves resist such closure. They do not declare, they describe. Perhaps the most honest approach is to treat them as records of encounter, not necessarily with beings, but with limits. Encounters with the boundaries of human capacity, with forces that shape development, whether intentional or emergent. The Anunnaki may represent those forces personified, named so they could be discussed at all. In this view, the 7 human conditions are not races or castes, but adaptive responses, different ways of being human that stabilize the whole. Over time, as context was lost, these conditions hardened into identity. Function became fate. Modern attempts to erase difference entirely may therefore miss the point. The issue is not difference itself, but whether difference serves balance or domination. Without understanding its origin, humanity oscillates between enforcing hierarchy and denying variation, unable to integrate either successfully. This oscillation is visible in contemporary debates about equality, identity, and purpose. We sense that something is inherited, yet resist naming it. We insist on autonomy, while living within structures that feel pre-existing. The tension produces anxiety rather than clarity. The rediscovery of ancient texts does not resolve this anxiety. It amplifies it. Each translation adds nuance but removes certainty. Each discovery opens new questions that cannot be answered with existing tools. This may explain why popular culture gravitates toward extreme interpretations. Alien architects, suppressed truths, secret rulers. These narratives offer decisive answers where academia offers ambiguity. They provide villains and intentions, simplifying what is otherwise unbearably complex. Yet simplification carries its own cost. It externalizes responsibility. It turns structural inheritance into conspiracy. It replaces humility with suspicion. The Sumerian record does not encourage this. It presents a world shaped by forces larger than individuals, governed by systems that do not care about belief. The Anunnaki argue not over morality but over burden. Humanity is introduced not as hero or victim, but as participant. This perspective does not absolve suffering, it reframes it. Collapse becomes consequence rather than punishment. Division becomes structure rather than curse. Forgetting becomes adaptation rather than failure. If modern humanity is to engage honestly with these texts, it must resist both dismissal and literalism. It must sit with uncertainty. It must accept that some questions cannot be resolved without re-examining assumptions about what it means to be human. Perhaps the reason these ideas remain culturally radioactive is not because they are false, but because they are incomplete. They do not offer comfort. They do not offer absolution. They suggest that humanity's story began not with innocence or glory, but with constraint. And constraint is difficult to reconcile with narratives of progress. Yet within constraint lies possibility. Systems can evolve, boundaries can shift, capacities can be reactivated or redirected, but only if they are recognized as boundaries, not mistaken for fate. The Sumerian scribes did not tell humanity who it was meant to be. They recorded who it was allowed to be. The difference matters. As modern readers stand at the edge of these fragments, the choice is not whether to believe them, but how to listen. To hear not a declaration, but a caution. Not an answer, but an invitation to question assumptions older than memory. If humanity was shaped once to survive within limits, then understanding those limits may be the first step toward choosing which ones still serve and which ones no longer do. But such understanding requires patience, restraint, and a willingness to remain in uncertainty. The record does not rush, it waits, and perhaps it always has. As uncertainty settles into the modern reading of ancient records, a quieter realization begins to surface, one that does not depend on lost tablets or speculative interpretation. Even stripped of myth, even reduced to social habit, the divisions described in the earliest texts appear to have endured. Not as names or categories, but as tendencies that shape how humanity organizes itself again and again. Across history, societies reconstruct hierarchy almost instinctively. Even movements founded on equality develop inner stratifications. Even revolutions that reject inheritance reproduce privilege within a generation. Power concentrates, authority specializes. Certain individuals gravitate toward coordination, others toward execution, others toward preservation, others toward risk. These patterns arise regardless of ideology, geography, or era. This recurrence has often been explained through economics or psychology. Scarcity produces competition. Leadership attracts ambition. Fear creates submission. These explanations hold truth, but they do not fully account for the consistency of the outcome. Different conditions, same structure. Different beliefs, same arrangement. If humanity carries inherited distributions of capacity, ways of perceiving, responding, enduring, then social stratification may be less an invention than a reflection. Culture does not create difference. It amplifies or suppresses what already exists. This perspective is uncomfortable because it undermines moral simplicity. It suggests that inequality cannot be erased by decree alone, nor justified by it. It reframes difference as neither virtue nor failure, but as condition. The Sumerian record hints at this without commentary. Humanity is never described as homogeneous. Variation is assumed. The problem is not difference, but misalignment, difference operating without coordination. Modern society struggles precisely here. We attempt to flatten difference while relying on specialization. We insist on sameness while depending on diversity. The contradiction generates tension that manifests as conflict, resentment, and instability. The idea of 7 human conditions, stripped of literalism, may refer not to rigid classes but to ranges of function necessary for systemic resilience. Builders, organizers, preservers, adapters, risk-bearers, interpreters, stabilizers, roles that emerge organically in any sufficiently complex group. These roles are not identities, they are tendencies. When recognized and integrated, such tendencies stabilize systems. When denied or moralized, they produce imbalance. Some are overvalued, others suppressed. The system strains. This may explain why periods of relative stability often coincide with acceptance of role differentiation, while periods of upheaval coincide with attempts to enforce uniformity or elevate a single function above all others. When coordination fails, collapse follows. The Sumerian texts do not advocate this explicitly. They simply reflect a world in which coordination was once maintained by structures now absent. When those structures withdrew, whether through catastrophe, transformation, or obsolescence, Humanity inherited function without framework. The result is improvisation. Each civilization rebuilds coordination differently, drawing on fragments of memory and immediate necessity. Some succeed temporarily, none endure indefinitely. Modern global civilization faces this challenge at unprecedented scale. Complexity has outpaced coordination. Systems interact faster than understanding can keep up. Specialized knowledge fragments across disciplines that rarely communicate. The whole becomes difficult to perceive. In such conditions, ancient questions resurface with renewed urgency. Not questions about gods or origins, but about design. What kind of system is humanity operating within? What functions are required to maintain balance? Which differences matter, and which are artifacts of outdated structure? The danger lies in confusing moral equality with functional uniformity. To treat all difference as injustice is to ignore systemic need. To treat all hierarchy as oppression is to overlook coordination. Yet to accept hierarchy without scrutiny is to invite abuse. The Sumerian record offers no solution, only context. It suggests that humanity once operated within a framework that acknowledged difference without moralizing it. That framework no longer exists. What remains is the challenge of reconstructing coordination without repeating domination. This challenge is not philosophical alone, it is practical. Climate systems destabilize, economic networks strain, information ecosystems fragment. The patterns resemble earlier cycles of expansion and collapse, but amplified by scale. If humanity was once designed or adapted to function within limits, then exceeding those limits without awareness invites correction. Not from gods or fate, but from the system itself. Collapse becomes feedback. The persistent fascination with ancient resets reflects this anxiety. Flood myths, lost civilizations, vanished golden ages. These are not escapism, they are rehearsal. Humanity testing narratives to understand failure without confronting present risk directly. The idea that humanity may be approaching another threshold is not new. It appears in ancient texts as warning, in modern discourse as crisis. What differs now is awareness. We can observe the system in motion, even if we cannot yet steer it effectively. If the sevenfold structure once distributed function to maintain balance, then rediscovering its logic, not its literal form, may offer guidance, not as destiny, but as diagnostic. A way to ask which functions are overemphasized, which neglected, which suppressed. This does not require belief in ancient architects. It requires recognition that systems evolve constraints independent of intention, that freedom emerges within structure, not outside it. The Sumerian scribes did not present humanity as tragic or heroic. They presented it as adaptive, capable of learning but prone to forgetting, able to rebuild but not to escape pattern entirely. Perhaps this is why their record remains unfinished, not because it lacks an ending, but because it describes a process that never concludes. Humanity adjusts, collapses, recovers, and adjusts again. The question is whether adjustment can become conscious. If humanity can recognize inherited tendencies without turning them into identities, if it can coordinate difference without moralizing it, then perhaps the next cycle need not mirror the last. But this requires a shift from blame to design, from ideology to integration. The risk is that without such a shift, ancient patterns will continue to express themselves through modern forms. Inequality will persist under new names. Hierarchy will re-emerge disguised as merit or necessity. Collapse will arrive reframed as surprise. The Sumerian record does not predict this. It implies it. Through silence, through repetition, through the refusal to simplify. As the fragments settle into the present, they do not demand belief, they demand attention. Not to the past as it was, but to the structures it reveals. If humanity was once shaped to survive within limits, then the work now is not to recover a lost blueprint, but to recognize where limits still operate and where they no longer serve. The quiet question remains, hovering without resolution. Are the divisions humanity struggles with the remnants of an ancient system no longer understood, or the raw material from which a new coordination could emerge? The record does not answer. It waits, as it always has, for the next attempt. By the time the question reaches the present, it has shed most of its original names. The Anunnaki no longer appear as figures to be debated directly. The sevenfold structure no longer insists on literal interpretation. What remains is something more elusive and more difficult to confront, ambiguity that refuses resolution. The temptation at this stage is to decide, to declare that the divisions were biological or symbolic or social, to choose one explanation and discard the rest. Yet the Sumerian record resists this narrowing. Its strength lies precisely in its refusal to separate these domains. Biology, cognition, role, and myth are entangled, not distinct. To extract one is to distort the whole. If humanity was shaped or adapted, then the shaping likely operated across multiple layers at once. Bodies, minds, and social structures evolve together. A change in one reinforces change in the others. Over time, the origin of the change becomes untraceable. What remains feels natural. This entanglement may explain why debates about human difference become so volatile. Attempts to locate difference exclusively in biology risk dehumanization. Attempts to locate it exclusively in culture risk denial. Both approaches simplify what is inherently complex. The sevenfold idea, when stripped of literalism, begins to resemble a spectrum rather than a taxonomy. Not 7 races, but 7 modes. Not fixed categories, but ranges of expression. These modes would overlap, interact, and shift within individuals and across populations, yet still cluster around familiar poles. Such clustering is observable without invoking ancient design. Personality research identifies recurring dimensions of behavior. Cognitive science reveals variation in perception, attention, and risk tolerance. Social systems spontaneously differentiate roles even when formal hierarchy is discouraged. These phenomena emerge repeatedly, independent of ideology. What the Sumerian record contributes is not an explanation, but a warning. It suggests that these patterns are older than modern frameworks and less pliable than political theory assumes. They are not inventions to be dismantled at will. They are conditions to be navigated. This does not mean they are immutable. Conditions can be reshaped. Modes can be integrated. But denial invites distortion. Suppression invites backlash. The ancient texts imply that balance once required coordination among differences, not their erasure. Each condition served a purpose within a larger system. When that system functioned, difference did not produce hierarchy in the moral sense. It produced stability. Hierarchy emerged later, when coordination failed and power filled the vacuum left by understanding. This distinction matters. Hierarchy is not synonymous with structure. Domination is not synonymous with order. Confusing these leads to cycles of overcorrection, either rigid stratification or forced uniformity, both of which destabilize systems in different ways. The Sumerian scribes did not leave instructions for avoiding this trap. They recorded its existence. Perhaps they understood that no instruction could survive the loss of context, that future societies would need to rediscover integration on their own terms. Modern humanity stands in that position now, aware of difference, wary of hierarchy, yet dependent on specialization, suspicious of inherited roles, yet unable to function without them. The tension is not ideological, it is structural. The question of whether the 7 human conditions were biological or symbolic may therefore be misguided. The more useful question is whether humanity has ever successfully integrated its differences without turning them into justification for control. History offers few examples. Periods of relative balance are brief. They rely on shared understanding, mutual constraint, and distributed responsibility. When these erode, systems polarize, functions collapse into identities, coordination gives way to conflict. The fascination with ancient wisdom often arises during such moments. Not because the past offers solutions, but because it reveals that the present is not unique. Humanity has encountered these limits before. The Sumerian record does not depict an idealized golden age. It depicts a managed one. Balance required effort, oversight, adjustment. It was not self-sustaining. When that effort ceased, imbalance followed. This suggests that any future integration of human difference will require ongoing attention, not static doctrine. It cannot be encoded once and enforced indefinitely. It must remain adaptive. The danger of romanticizing ancient design is that it tempts humanity to seek authority rather than responsibility, to imagine that answers lie buried, waiting to be uncovered, rather than requiring conscious construction. The danger of dismissing ancient patterns is equal. It tempts humanity to believe it can reinvent itself without consequence, ignoring constraints that will reassert themselves regardless of belief. The Sumerian scribes avoided both extremes. They neither glorified nor denied the structures they recorded. They treated them as given, not ideal. This restraint may be their most valuable legacy. If the sevenfold structure was once a way of describing human variation within a system of balance, then its loss does not free humanity from difference. It removes the language to coordinate it. Modern language fills the gap with moral categories that strain under complexity, good and evil, privileged and oppressed, normal and abnormal. These binaries simplify at the cost of nuance. The result is a culture perpetually at war with itself, unable to reconcile its values with its functioning. Equality becomes aspiration rather than practice. Freedom becomes anxiety rather than possibility. The ancient record does not promise resolution. It suggests endurance. Humanity persists not because it perfects its systems, but because it adapts within their failure. If there is a lesson to be drawn, it is not that humanity was created in 7 forms, but that it has always required multiple forms of participation to survive. When those forms are denied or absolutized, instability follows. The lingering mystery is whether humanity can now recognize this without retreating into hierarchy or denial. Whether integration can be achieved consciously without the scaffolding of forgotten systems. The Sumerian texts end without closure. They fade into silence, leaving behind questions that resist final answer. This is not oversight. It is fidelity to experience. Systems do not conclude. They transform. As the fragments settle into the present, they do not instruct. They observe. They reflect a species repeatedly encountering the limits of its own design, whether imposed or emergent. The final uncertainty remains intact. Were the divisions within humanity an ancient solution to a problem no longer visible, or an early accommodation whose time has passed? And if they were both, how does a species honour the need for difference without surrendering to domination? The record offers no reassurance, only a quiet continuity of pattern, waiting to see whether this iteration will repeat what came before, or discover a way to hold complexity without collapse. What remains at the end of this long trail of fragments is not an answer, but a posture, a way of standing before what cannot be fully retrieved. The Sumerian record does not culminate in revelation. It thins, quiets, and finally releases the reader into uncertainty. There is no final tablet that explains everything, no concluding voice that gathers the strands and declares their meaning. The silence is deliberate. If humanity was once shaped within a framework it no longer remembers, then forgetting may not have been an accident. Memory, after all, is not neutral. What is remembered shapes what is possible. What is forgotten shapes what is permitted. A species burdened with too much awareness of its own constraints might never attempt to exceed them. Perhaps this is why the origin remains fractured, not erased, but scattered. Enough survives to unsettle, not enough to command belief, enough to provoke questioning, not enough to anchor certainty. The idea that humanity emerged through adjustment rather than singular creation carries a quiet implication. It suggests that being human has always been provisional, not fixed, not complete, but responsive to conditions that change over time. Humanity is not a finished form, it is a working one. In this light, the sevenfold structure no longer needs to be literal or historical. It becomes a lens through which to view endurance, a reminder that survival requires multiplicity, that no single way of being human is sufficient on its own, that stability arises from coordination, not dominance. What becomes dangerous is not difference, but forgetting why difference exists. When roles lose context, they harden into identities. When identities are moralized, they turn into weapons. When systems lose flexibility, they fracture under strain. The ancient record does not condemn this, it observes it. Again and again, across cycles of rise and collapse, the same pattern unfolds. Complexity grows, coordination falters, correction arrives. Humanity rebuilds with fewer assumptions, then forgets again. Modern humanity often imagines itself as uniquely aware, uniquely capable of breaking this cycle. Yet awareness alone does not guarantee integration. Knowledge does not automatically produce wisdom. In some cases, it accelerates imbalance. A fascination with lost civilizations and ancient designers may reflect an intuition that something essential is missing. Not a ruler or a god, but a sense of proportion, a recognition of limits, a way of holding difference without turning it into hierarchy or denial. The Sumerian scribes did not leave instructions for achieving this balance. They left records of what happens when it is present and when it is not. They trusted the future to encounter the same questions under new conditions. Perhaps this is why their writing feels strangely modern, not because it anticipates our technologies, but because it recognizes our predicament. A species capable of extraordinary coordination, yet perpetually destabilized by its own success. If humanity was once constrained deliberately, then forgetting those constraints may have been necessary for growth. But growth without remembrance risks repetition. Expansion without reflection invites collapse. The challenge, then, is not to recover an ancient blueprint, but to develop a new literacy of limits. To understand that freedom does not mean absence of structure, but participation in one that can adapt. That equality does not require sameness, but mutual recognition of contribution. This is not a return to hierarchy. It is a movement toward integration, a system where difference is neither erased nor exalted, but understood as part of a larger balance. The ancient texts do not tell us how to build such a system. They tell us that systems fail when they forget why they exist. They remind us that coordination requires effort, attention, and humility, that no structure sustains itself indefinitely without adjustment. As the record fades, what remains is a sense of continuity. Humanity has always stood at the edge of its own understanding, negotiating between what it remembers and what it must forget to continue. The Anunnaki, whether understood as beings, as symbols, or personified constraints, recede not because they are disproven, but because their role is complete. They represent a phase of mediation no longer accessible. What remains is responsibility without instruction. This may be the true inheritance, not a lost technology or suppressed truth, but a condition of adulthood. Humanity no longer guided, no longer overseen, no longer adjusted from outside. Free to adapt, but also free to fail. The sevenfold idea dissolves into this responsibility. It no longer describes what humanity is, but what it requires to endure. Diversity of perception, distribution of function, capacity for coordination, willingness to recalibrate. If these elements can be held together consciously, then the ancient cycle need not repeat exactly as before. Collapse may still occur, but learning could shape its form. Memory could soften its impact. The Sumerian record does not promise this outcome. It offers no optimism. It offers continuity, a quiet insistence that humanity has faced its limits before and will face them again. The final silence is not empty. It is spacious. It allows the question to remain open, unclaimed by doctrine or dismissal. What if humanity was never meant to remember its beginning clearly? Because clarity would tempt certainty, and certainty would prevent adaptation. What if forgetting was not failure, but strategy? And if so, what does it mean that fragments still surface? Enough to disturb, but not enough to conclude. Perhaps remembrance arrives only when conditions demand it. Perhaps the past speaks only when the present begins to resemble it too closely. The record ends where it began, in the middle of a thought. Humanity already in motion, already divided, already adapting. No warning is given, no answer delivered. Only a lingering awareness that the story has never been about who created humanity, but about how humanity continues within limits it did not choose and responsibilities it cannot relinquish. The clay tablets rest again in silence, not waiting to be solved, but waiting to be approached with care. They do not ask for belief, they ask for patience. And as the last traces of the record fade into the quiet of the present moment, the question remains, unresolved, unhurried, and perhaps intentionally so, whether humanity will continue to repeat what it does not remember, or finally learn how to carry difference, memory and restraint without needing another reset to remind it why balance matters.